Get out of this house. The words didn't just echo through the living room, they sliced through me like something sharp and irreversible, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood there, frozen, staring at my son as if I didn't recognize the man in front of me, even though I had spent decades knowing every inch of his face, every shift in his voice, every hidden emotion behind his eyes. This was not the boy I had raised, not the child I had held through sleepless nights, fevers, heartbreaks, and fears, and yet here he was, standing tall in the very home I built, telling me to leave as if I were nothing more than an unwanted guest. My fingers trembled slightly as they brushed against the edge of the wooden table beside me, the same table where he had once sat doing his homework while I prepared dinner, the same table where we laughed, argued, celebrated birthdays, and shared stories that once made us feel like a family. "Ryan, what are you saying?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely holding together as it carried across the room, fragile and uncertain, hoping, desperately hoping, that this was some kind of misunderstanding, some moment of anger that would pass as quickly as it had come. But he didn't soften, didn't hesitate, didn't even look at me the way a son looks at his mother. Instead, his expression remained cold, distant, almost rehearsed, like he had been preparing for this moment long before it ever arrived. "You heard me," he said flatly, his tone stripped of any warmth. "This house is mine now. You've done enough damage already." Damage. The word echoed in my mind, louder than anything else he had said, louder than the command to leave, louder than the silence that followed. Damage. What damage could a mother possibly do by loving too much, by giving too much, by sacrificing pieces of herself so her child could have a better life? My heart pounded against my chest as I tried to understand how everything had shifted so suddenly, how the years of care, of devotion, of quiet strength had been reduced to a single accusation that made me feel like a stranger in my own life. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though part of me was already afraid of the answer, afraid of what had been planted in his mind, afraid of the distance that now stood between us like an invisible wall. Before he could respond, I heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway, and then she appeared, Melissa, her presence filling the space with a kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips as her eyes settled on me with a mixture of judgment and quiet triumph. "You gave him nothing but guilt and control," she said, her voice cutting in with a sharpness that made my stomach twist. "It's time you stopped pretending to be the victim." In that moment, something inside me shifted, not with anger, but with a quiet, painful understanding that this wasn't just about my son's frustration or confusion. This was something deeper, something influenced, something carefully shaped over time until it reached this breaking point. I looked back at Ryan, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hesitation, any trace of the boy who used to run into my arms without a second thought, but all I found was resolve, a hardened expression that told me he had already made up his mind. The realization settled over me slowly, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe with every passing second. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a moment. This was a decision. And I was no longer a part of it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, as if the memories that once filled it with warmth were now suffocating me with their presence. I glanced around, taking in every detail, the framed photos on the walls, the worn edges of the furniture, the soft light filtering through the curtains I had chosen years ago. Each piece a reminder of a life I had built with love, now slipping away from me without a fight. For a brief moment, I considered arguing, defending myself, reminding him of everything we had been through together, but the words never came. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, a quiet clarity that cut through the chaos of emotions swirling inside my chest. If this was how he saw me now, if this was the place I held in his life, then no amount of pleading or explaining would change it. I met his gaze one last time, holding onto it just long enough to memorize the distance in his eyes, to accept the reality of what was happening, and then I nodded slowly. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, carrying a quiet strength that surprised even me. "I'll go." There was no reaction from him, no relief, no regret, just silence, as if my departure had already been decided long before I spoke the words. I turned away, my movements deliberate and controlled, refusing to let my hands shake or my shoulders slump as I walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because I didn't want to leave, but because I was leaving behind more than just a house. I was leaving behind a version of my life that no longer existed. When I reached the doorway, I paused for just a second, my hand resting against the frame as I allowed myself one final glance at the place I had once called home. And then, without another word, I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any argument ever could, carrying with me nothing but my dignity, my silence, and a secret they would soon regret never knowing. They thought I left with nothing, and that illusion was perhaps the only thing that gave them comfort in the days that followed, the quiet belief that I had been stripped of everything I ever had, reduced to a helpless woman with nowhere to go and nothing to hold on to. But what they never understood, what they never even considered, was that I had spent years building something they could neither see nor control, something that didn't rely on their approval, their presence, or their permission to exist. Long before that night, long before the sharp words and colder silence, I had learned a lesson life teaches quietly and often painfully: never place your entire future in someone else's hands. No matter how much you love them, no matter how much you trust them, because people change, circumstances shift, and sometimes the very ones you sacrifice everything for become the ones who take the most without realizing it. It wasn't bitterness that drove me to plan ahead, it was instinct, the kind that whispers softly when everything on the surface seems fine but something deep within feels unsettled. Years ago, after my husband passed and I was left to navigate life alone while raising Ryan, I started making small decisions, careful ones, investing modest amounts, saving quietly, learning things I had never imagined I would need to understand, all while maintaining the appearance of a simple, ordinary life centered entirely around my son. To him, I was just his mother, the one who cooked, cleaned, supported, worried, and loved endlessly, but behind that role was a woman who refused to let uncertainty define her future. I remember the first time I opened that private account, how strange it felt to do something solely for myself, something that didn't immediately benefit anyone else, and yet over time, that small step turned into something much larger, something powerful, something that would one day become my escape without me even knowing it. The investments grew slowly at first, then steadily, then significantly, each careful decision adding another layer of security, another piece of independence, until it became more than just a safety net. It became a quiet foundation beneath everything I did. There were moments when I almost told Ryan, moments when I considered putting his name on it, trusting him with the very thing that represented years of discipline and foresight, but every time I got close, something held me back, something I couldn't quite explain, a hesitation that lingered just long enough for me to step away from the decision and leave things as they were. At the time, I questioned myself, wondering if I was being overly cautious, if I was holding back unnecessarily, but now, looking back, I realized that hesitation wasn't doubt, it was protection, a quiet form of wisdom that I didn't fully understand until the moment everything else fell apart. The night I walked out of that house, I didn't feel powerful or victorious. I felt empty, like a part of me had been left behind with every step I took away from the life I once knew, and yet beneath that emptiness, there was something else, something steady and unshaken that kept me from breaking completely. I checked into a small hotel, nothing extravagant, just a clean room with neutral walls and a bed that felt unfamiliar, a temporary space that reflected the uncertainty of my situation. And as I sat there in the quiet, the weight of what had happened slowly began to settle over me, pressing down in waves of disbelief, sadness, and a strange, distant calm. My hands rested in my lap for a long time before I finally reached for my phone, not out of panic or desperation, but out of a need to remind myself of something real, something untouched by the chaos I had just left behind. When the screen lit up and I opened my account, the numbers stared back at me with a clarity that cut through everything else. $12 million, sitting there silently, unchanged by the argument, unaffected by the rejection, existing as proof that I was not as powerless as they believed. I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate, I simply stared at it, letting the reality sink in slowly, understanding not just what it meant financially, but what it represented in a much deeper sense. It was freedom, yes, but it was also validation, confirmation that the years I spent preparing, the choices I made quietly and independently, had not been in vain. For the first time since the confrontation, my breathing steadied, my thoughts became clearer, and the overwhelming sense of loss began to shift into something else, not anger, not even relief, but a quiet determination that settled firmly in my chest. The next morning, I woke up not as someone who had been cast out, but as someone who had been released, someone who no longer had to fight for a place in a life where she was no longer valued. I didn't rush into anything, didn't make impulsive decisions driven by emotion. Instead, I moved carefully, deliberately, as I always had, starting with small but meaningful steps. I found a temporary apartment, simple but comfortable, a space that felt like a blank page waiting to be filled, and as I signed the lease, I realized something important. I wasn't starting over from nothing. I was starting over with everything I had quietly built over the years. That distinction changed everything. I spent the following days organizing my finances, meeting with advisors, ensuring that every detail was secure and structured in a way that gave me complete control, not out of fear, but out of respect for what I had created. And somewhere in the midst of those practical decisions, I made 3 promises to myself, not spoken out loud but deeply understood. I would never go back to a place where I was not respected. I would never beg for love or acceptance from those who could not see my worth, and I would never again underestimate the strength that comes from standing on your own, even when it feels like everything else has been taken away. What they saw as my downfall was, in reality, my turning point, a quiet shift from dependence to independence, from being defined by my role in someone else's life to defining my own path without apology or hesitation. And the most powerful part of it all was that they didn't even realize it yet. They didn't understand what they had lost, what they had pushed away, or what they had underestimated, but in time, they would. Not because I would tell them, not because I would confront them or seek revenge in the way they might expect, but because the truth has a way of revealing itself, slowly and unmistakably, until it can no longer be ignored. A week later, just as I was beginning to settle into the quiet rhythm of my new life, my phone rang, breaking the stillness of the morning in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable. And when I looked at the screen and saw Ryan's name, I didn't feel the rush of emotion I once would have, no immediate concern, no instinctive urge to answer right away. Just a calm awareness that this moment had been coming ever since I walked out that door, and for a few seconds I simply stared at it, letting it ring, considering whether I was ready to hear whatever he had to say, knowing deep down that this call wasn't about reconciliation or understanding but about something far more practical. Something that had likely gone wrong in the world he thought he had under control, and when I finally answered, my voice was steady, almost detached, as if I were speaking to someone I used to know rather than someone who had once been the center of my life. "Hello?" I said quietly, and there was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that immediately told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke, because the confidence, the cold certainty he had shown that night was gone, replaced by something fragile, uncertain, and edged with panic. "Mom. I need to talk to you," he said, his voice uneven, and I could almost picture him running a hand through his hair the way he used to when he was stressed, a habit that hadn't changed even if everything else had. And I didn't respond right away, not out of spite but because I wanted him to feel the silence, to understand what it meant when the person who had always been there no longer rushed to fill the space. "The bank, they're saying the mortgage hasn't been fully transferred, and there are accounts, things I don't understand," he continued quickly, the words tumbling out as if he were trying to fix the situation just by explaining it fast enough, and I leaned back slightly, letting his panic settle into the conversation without interrupting. Because this wasn't a moment that needed to be rushed or softened, it was a moment that needed to be experienced fully, exactly as it was. "Yes," I said after a brief pause, my tone calm and measured. "I handled those things," and there was another silence, heavier this time, as if he were realizing that the foundation he thought was secure had always been supported by something he never took the time to understand. "Mom, where are you?" he asked, and I could hear the shift in his voice, the way it softened slightly, not with affection but with uncertainty, as though my physical absence had finally become real to him in a way it hadn't been before, and I turned my gaze toward the window of my apartment, where the city stretched out in quiet motion below, people moving through their lives without knowing anything about mine, a reminder that the world doesn't stop for anyone's personal collapse. "I'm somewhere peaceful," I replied, choosing my words carefully, not to provoke him but to state a simple truth, one that carried more meaning than he would immediately understand. "Mom, we might lose the house," he said, and there it was, the real reason for the call, not concern for me, not regret for what had been said, but fear of losing something material, something that suddenly mattered now that it was at risk, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that reality settle in without letting it hurt the way it might have before. "Ryan," I said gently, "do you remember what you told me?" And he didn't answer right away, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm that he did, that those words hadn't disappeared as easily as he might have hoped. "You told me to get out," I continued, my voice steady but not harsh, and I listened, and I could hear his breathing change, the weight of his own actions pressing back on him in a way that no one else could have made him feel. "Mom, please." Melissa didn't understand. "She pushed things too far," he said quickly, as if shifting the blame might somehow undo what had already been done, but I shook my head slightly, even though he couldn't see me, because this wasn't something that could be redirected or excused. "No," I said softly, "you didn't understand," and the words weren't meant to attack him, they were simply the truth, clear and unavoidable. "I gave you everything I could," I continued, "not just money or a place to live, but stability, support, a foundation to build your life on, and instead of seeing that, you chose to believe I was the problem." And there was a pause on his end, longer this time, filled with something that sounded like realization, or maybe regret, but I didn't rush to interpret it, because understanding doesn't come instantly. It comes slowly, often painfully, and only when someone is ready to face it. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier urgency, and for a brief moment something inside me softened, a familiar instinct to comfort, to forgive, to close the distance between us before it grew any wider, but I held that instinct in place, not rejecting it, just not acting on it immediately, because forgiveness given too quickly can sometimes erase the lesson that needs to be learned. "You'll be okay," I said instead, keeping my tone calm and even, "you're capable of figuring this out," and he didn't respond right away, as if he had expected something else, maybe reassurance, maybe an offer to fix everything the way I always had before, but this time was different. This time I wasn't stepping back into the role he had so easily dismissed. "Mom, I don't know what to do," he admitted, and there was something genuine in that moment, something vulnerable that reminded me of the boy he used to be, but also something that needed to grow beyond dependence, beyond expecting someone else to solve every problem. "Then learn," I said quietly, not unkindly, because that's what being an adult means, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything that had been left unsaid, everything that could no longer be ignored or undone. I didn't hang up out of anger, I didn't raise my voice or demand an apology, I simply ended the call with a quiet finality that mirrored the way I had walked out of that house, leaving him not with punishment, but with responsibility, because sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't delivered through confrontation or revenge, but through absence, through the space where someone once stood, steady and supportive, until one day they're gone and all that remains is the realization of what they truly meant. Weeks passed, then months, and in that stretch of time something quietly extraordinary happened, not around me, but within me. As the noise of the past faded into a distant echo and the weight I had carried for so long began to lift in ways I hadn't thought possible, and although I never reached out to Ryan, never tried to reinsert myself into the life that had so abruptly pushed me out, pieces of his reality still found their way to me through mutual acquaintances and quiet whispers that carried more truth than they intended, and from what I gathered, the life he had so confidently defended began to unravel almost as quickly as it had been constructed. The house he fought to claim becoming more burden than blessing as financial pressures mounted and responsibilities he had never fully understood closed in around him. And without the steady foundation I had always provided, the cracks that had once been invisible grew wider until they could no longer be ignored, and Melissa, who had once stood so firmly at his side, began to pull away when things stopped being easy, her patience thinning as the reality of their situation replaced the illusion she had helped create. Until eventually even she was gone, leaving Ryan alone in the very space he had insisted I no longer belonged in, and when I first heard that she had left, I didn't feel satisfaction or vindication the way some might expect. I felt a quiet sadness, not for the situation itself, but for the lesson wrapped inside it, because life has a way of revealing truths that words alone never can, and sometimes those truths come only after everything else has fallen apart. Meanwhile, my own life was taking on a shape that felt unfamiliar yet deeply right, like stepping into a version of myself I had once set aside without even realizing it. And instead of focusing on what I had lost, I began to notice what I had gained: space, clarity, independence, and a kind of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or presence. And with the resources I had carefully built over the years, I created a home that reflected not just comfort but intention, a place where every detail felt like a quiet affirmation that I was allowed to exist fully as my own person, not just as someone's mother or support system. And I spent my days exploring things I had long postponed, traveling to places I had only ever seen in photographs, reconnecting with old friends whose conversations reminded me of who I had been before life became centered entirely around giving. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to smile more easily, to breathe more deeply, to feel a sense of contentment that didn't come from being needed but from simply being. Then one afternoon, as the sun filtered softly through the windows of my living room, there was a knock on the door, a simple, ordinary sound that somehow carried an unexpected weight, and when I opened it, I found Ryan standing there, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because the distance between us wasn't measured in steps or time but in everything that had happened since the last time we stood face to face. And he looked different, not just physically, though there was a tiredness in his posture and a heaviness in his eyes, but something deeper, something that suggested the certainty he once carried had been replaced by understanding, the kind that comes only after mistakes have been made and consequences have been lived through. "Mom," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and there was no anger in it, no defensiveness, just a fragile honesty that made it impossible to ignore. And I stepped back slightly, not as an automatic gesture of forgiveness but as an acknowledgement that this moment deserved to unfold without barriers. "I messed up," he continued, the words coming slowly, as if each one required effort, and I didn't interrupt him, didn't rush to respond, because this wasn't about me explaining anything. It was about him recognizing it on his own. "I lost everything," he said, and there was no attempt to soften the truth or shift the blame, and in that admission I heard something real for the first time in a long while. Something that went beyond circumstance and reached into accountability. "And I realize now, you were the only one who ever truly cared," he added, his voice breaking slightly, and I watched him carefully, not with judgment but with a quiet awareness of how much had changed, not just in his situation but in his understanding. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "I just needed to say I'm sorry." And in that moment I saw not the man who had told me to leave, but the boy who had once looked to me for guidance. The child who had made mistakes and learned from them, and something inside me shifted, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in a steady, grounded sense that the anger I once felt had already done its work and no longer needed to stay. I stepped aside fully then, opening the door a little wider, and said simply, "Come in," and he hesitated for a second, as if unsure whether he had the right, and when he finally stepped inside, his eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the space, the atmosphere, the quiet sense of balance that filled it. "This place, it's beautiful," he said softly, and I gave a small, almost unnoticeable smile. "It's peaceful," I replied, because that was the word that mattered most, the one that defined everything I had built since leaving. We sat down together, the silence between us no longer tense but reflective, and after a moment I spoke, not to reopen old wounds but to acknowledge what had happened in a way that allowed it to settle without being ignored. "You took something from me that day," I said, my voice calm, and he lowered his head slightly, already knowing what I meant, but before he could respond, I continued, "But you also gave me something," and he looked up, confusion flickering briefly in his eyes. "You gave me the chance to start again," I said, and there was no bitterness in my tone, only truth, and as he absorbed those words, I could see the weight of them land in a way that didn't crush him but grounded him. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just sincerity, and I nodded, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because some things don't need to be perfect to be real. In the end, my revenge was never about taking anything from him or making him suffer in the way I had suffered. It was about living fully without him, about showing, without words or confrontation, that my strength had never depended on his acceptance, and that losing me was something he would come to understand on his own, not through punishment, but through experience. And as I sat there with him in that quiet room, I realized that the sweetest kind of revenge isn't loud or cruel or even intentional, It's the quiet transformation that happens when you choose yourself after being discarded, the steady rebuilding of a life that no longer revolves around those who failed to value it, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the greatest lesson you can give someone is the chance to see exactly what they lost when they thought they were losing nothing at all.